So the session aims, I've really split the session into two halves. The first half, we're going to talk about specific tactics for structuring remote open book exams, so some practical tips. And then the second half, we're going to look at more of the pedagogy behind quizzes and exams and how you can minimise the impact of students Googling or colluding to answer their questions. Lots of time for questions at the end, or if you've got any, please add them to the chat as we go. And Tom Langston will kindly throw them through to me if there's anything that pops up that we can expand on. So let's get started with the content. Specific tactics. So here are some things you can do if you're delivering a Moodle-based exam, which is remote. And let's face it, we're all doing open book exams at the moment. So number one, you can randomize questions from a question bank. So if you've got a lot of questions in your bank, you can randomize the allocation of those questions into your quizzes. And that means that your students won't get the same questions as their friends. So it's harder for them to ask for a specific answer to question 1 or 2. You can also shuffle those questions, so how they appear in the quiz. So again, it's harder to kind of compare notes on questions. Obviously your exam should be timed. I would advise against overly long exam windows though. In May of last year, sorry, as we were delivering exams, a lot of people delivered exams with quite long exam windows. Sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes you've got students in different time zones and you want to make it available to them at a time that suits them. But what actually that means is if you offer a very long exam window, it gives students more time to compare notes and for them to work together to answer quizzes. So as much as possible, leave extra time for students to get connected and feel comfortable doing their exam, and we'll cover that in a minute. But I would advise against overly long exam windows. You should only give students one attempt at the quiz itself, so that they have less time to go off and find answers and come back and re-attempt it. So one attempt at the quiz. Colleagues in technology, when I ran this session a couple of months ago, said that they also only give one attempt per question. So students have to work through the questions and submit those, and they don't get a chance to come back and re-attempt those. I mean, that is a tactic that would stop students from being able to look up the answers so easily. Me personally, I would probably advise against that. I quite like the idea of students being able to save a question, think about it, and then come back to it. I think that's fair. But it is another tactic that you could employ. You could allow students just to have one attempt at the question and then move on. Obviously, we're not going to give students feedback on their questions, whether they're right or wrong within the exam. So switch those options off. Here's a tactic which will be quite useful for you when you're writing questions. And that's a general rule of thumb about whether you can find the answer to this question on Google within 90 seconds. So I say 90 seconds, so we've got an hour exam with 40 questions, so that's 90 seconds per question. That's how long the student gets to work on each question roughly. Some colleagues I've spoken to in science have said, and actually governing bodies have said it should be closer to 60 seconds. So it depends on your discipline, but the general rule is, can you find the answer to that question within 90 seconds or a minute? Go off on Google and see if you can find the answer to that question. And a lot of the things I'll talk about in the second half of this session will be geared around how you make it harder for students to find that answer within that kind of time frame. Okay, so that's some specific tactics. I'm now going to talk about a guide, which the link's available there, and I'll share it again at the end. But back in April time, I wrote a guide about the practical considerations for remote online exams in Moodle. So some hints and tips about what you can do to structure exams and how you can set them up so they run kind of seamlessly and don't run into headaches. So I'm going to take a few of those examples and talk about those in a bit more detail. But the link will be available if you want to have a look through the guide yourselves. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to talk about in that guide is being prepared. I've put a link in that guide to a demo exam, and I'll click on that now. And the idea of this really is to make sure that students are comfortable with what will happen on exam day. So I'd advise that students attempt this on their own laptop or desktop machine, where possible, the device they're going to use on exam day, and kind of mock up the situation that they'll find on that day of the exam. So what we're trying to do really is make sure their laptops and desktops are okay for taking the exam, and any headaches they run into, they can iron out before the exam day. So when they sit down on that exam day, they feel comfortable, excuse me, and confident to take the exam. So this module was mocked up with the exam in the run of things on the course, but it's also under the assessments tab. So another thing we'd recommend is put the exam in that table, so it's the common place that students go to find it. So they can press that link and they can attempt it in advance. So yeah, it's all about making students feel comfortable and at ease with the process for taking an exam online, especially if they've never done that before. If it's their first year at the university and it's their first time taking an online exam via our Moodle setup, then give this to them in advance and get them okay with that process. So that's the first tip. Second tip, students must leave enough time to complete their exam during an exam window. So as I say, I would advise against overly long exam windows if you can avoid it. I would recommend that actually, if you have students in different time zones, that you put those in different groups and maybe have those exams at different times that suit them, rather than having a very long exam window of 24 or 48 hours. What we've seen this time around with exams and the planning that's gone into it, that the exam windows are shorter. So typically you might have 3 hours to complete a 1.5 hour exam. But it's important that students leave enough time to actually complete the exam. If I was a student, I started at about 3 o'clock, thinking I've got an hour and a half to do it. The end time within a quiz in Moodle is a hard limit. So the timer in my exam, instead of showing 1.5 hours, would show an hour countdown. So make sure that students kind of start in good time, so that they can, so they don't run into kind of unexpected problems with starting the exam. Leave lots of time before the end. Okay, timed essay assignments. We've seen a lot of these scheduled for this exam window. So these are exams that maybe students would traditionally sit down in the hall and write for, say, 3 hours. There's some detailed guidance on this within the guide that I highlighted. But really, what I'd say is, don't use the Moodle essay question within a quiz for these long essay questions. So if you're expecting students to type for an hour on an essay question, don't use the Moodle essay question for that. What is a better tool for the job are either the Moodle assignment or the Turnitin assignment. You can provide a submission template with the questions and space to answer those, and any case study information or kind of surrounding context for the questions can be provided in those Word document templates. You can't specify a submission window, as I was talking about previously, so everyone starts at the same time and finishes at the same time. But the benefits for doing a timed essay assignment in this way are that the marking interface for yourselves is a lot better with the Moodle assignment or Turnitin. You get plagiarism checking, and it's much safer in terms of the potential for lost work. Moodle's not really designed to provide a space for students to type for an hour and automatically save all the time. So there's much more risk of students losing work if you go down that route. Much safer if you use Moodle or the Turnitin assignment. Obviously, there's a factor to bear in mind with this as well, which is whether students have Word installed on their machine and it's working. I would advise using Google Docs for a lot of these type of assignments, because it automatically saves. Students can very easily download their submission at the end and submit it from Google Docs. So Google Docs would be a good tool, I'd say, in this kind of situation. Okay, so at this point, we're going to switch over to the second part of the session. We're going to talk about some tactics and some approaches for how we can stop students Googling or clueding during a remote exam. But what I'd like to do is I'll put a link to this Padlet activity in the chat. It would be good if we can kind of talk through a couple of, so if I send this to everyone. Okay, so if you could press on that link and you will get to a Padlet board, which looks like this. So before I kind of I rush in and kind of tell you exactly how to do it, it would be much more kind of beneficial if we kind of talk about it first and kind of come up with some ideas from yourselves. So what would you say are your approaches or things that work for you, how can we stop students Googling or clueding during a remote exam? What are your tactics for minimizing the impact of Google and WhatsApp? All great stuff, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really valid one. Not MCQ. We will cover that. Yeah, MCQs are very easy to Google and to collude on to kind of work together to solve. Randomized questions. Yeah, that's a good one. Set up questions one page at a time. Yeah, that's a good piece of advice. That will mean that your students' answers to questions are saved on each submission of a question. I'm going to talk about a counterpoint to that one as we work through about combining questions and the value in doing that. But it's a very good piece of advice. Generally speaking, one question per page works very well and kind of saves those answers by students. Open-ended questions that ask students to consider a theory and apply it. Yeah, that's a very good point. Again, I will cover that in the second half of the session. But students applying their knowledge in a more free-form way is a good test of their knowledge, but also it's a lot harder to find the answers to those questions quickly when you're in an exam situation. Questions that cannot be Googled. Yep, Fermi type questions that don't have a definitive right or wrong answer, but there's more of a justification in students' responses. Great stuff. Okay, thank you very much for those ideas, and I'll pick a few of those apart as we move into the second half of the session. So let's go back to my second set of slides now. So the key to really stopping students from being able to Google the answers or effectively collude with other students is the questions you ask the students and the responses you want from them. So in front of us, we've got a picture of Bloom's digital taxonomy, and this is some action verbs. Let me just put my notes up on the screen as well so you can see what I'm doing. Present, and where are my notes? There they are. Great stuff. Okay, so with what we've got are so Bloom's breaks down activities into action verbs. So here's some examples of some of the activities which are mapped into those quadrants. Down here at the bottom, you've got remembering. So multiple choice questions really kind of fit into this category. You're presenting a student with a question with four answers, one's correct and 3 distractors. So you're just asking students to remember what they've been taught and then just regurgitate that knowledge. These are very, very easy to go off onto Google and find the answer to those questions, especially in that kind of in that time limit. But as we move up Bloom's taxonomy, we get into applying, analysing, evaluating, and these are a much better test of students' knowledge, and they they require more thought in the answers. There is a bit of a rub with this though, because as we move up through those layers, so at the bottom, so those lower order thinking skills like remembering, those are very easy to Google and collude on. But as we move up towards the top of the pyramid, or the top of the table, these skills test students' higher order thinking skills. So those type of questions, they're harder to Google, they're harder for students to collude on. So they're a much better test of students' knowledge. I'd argue that these are more authentic assessments, that the higher you move up the table as well, because there's more skill required from students to answer the questions. It's less about remembering, it's more about applying their knowledge in different contexts and different situations. So it's a closer examination to what they'd be expected to do in the workplace, possibly. And I'll give you some examples of that as we work through. And so the rub with this is that down here at the bottom, the lower order thinking skills, these questions are very easy to automatically mark. There's normally a definitive right or wrong answer. You can specify those in advance, and then Moodle will mark those for you automatically. As we move up to the top of the pyramid, these questions normally require manual marking, because you're normally asking students to type more, to justify their responses. So the way you get around that really is to have a good mix of different question types. So you can have a combination of MCQ question types, multiple choice questions, alongside richer questions. And I'll show you how those can be combined nicely. So you get a good mix of automatic marking and manual marking, just to give yourself a balance, because you don't want to be manually marking all the students' responses, but you can, by combining those, you can make your life a bit easier, but also ensure that it's much harder for students to cheat on their exam. Okay, so here's Bloom's taxonomy, kind of broken down per level. So I'll whiz through the first couple, because they're quite straightforward. So down here in remember, so it doesn't require understanding, it's just really a regurgitation of students' knowledge. So multiple choice questions are a good example of these remember type questions. What is, what, why did. I'll just press on this just to give you an example of a multiple choice question. So as I say, there's a question, there's one right answer and 4 incorrect answers. I could find the answer to that question on Google in 60 seconds, very, very easily. And students can too. They're very adept at going off and finding this information quickly. So the benefit is they'll be marked automatically, but are we really testing students' knowledge? Not really, especially when we can't lock down students' kind of exam environment very easily. So easy to Google, easy to guess, and easy to collude on. Next, we've got understand questions. So these are questions that students do need to understand some of the theory behind it to answer the questions. So keywords here are describe, distinguish, explain, interpret, predict. So example questions: which of the following, what is shown? So it's not just a regurgitation of knowledge. Students do have to understand a bit about what they're being asked. So some example Moodle question types: numerical questions can fall into this category. Pattern match questions and matching questions are in this category. So they're still very easy to Google, very easy to guess. So a tactic for making these harder, making it more difficult for students to find the answer on Google, is to combine these questions together and to give them a context. So mixing question types. So you could have on the page, you can either separate this as 2 questions on 2 pages, so the answer is saved after each page submit, or you could have 2 questions on the page. By doing that, by having 2 questions on the page with a bit of context at the top, you're giving students more information that they have to process to answer the questions. So it's a better test of their knowledge. I'd also say if you're going to use an image, that maybe one you've constructed yourself is a good starting point, because students will find it very difficult to find that exact image on the internet. Or if you've used an image from the internet, doctor it in such a way or edit it to take out kind of key bits of information. So it's harder for students to use a reverse image search like TinEye to take that image and search the web for where that image came from. If you change it, or if you create it yourself, that will make it harder for students to go off and find the answer to their question very quickly. But as I say, if you provide a context with something like a graph or an image, you can ask multiple questions of it. So the first question, so what time period is highlighted at point A above? Students can probably work that out based on filling in the gaps of these dates to work out that is World War II. So that's quite easy for them to kind of work out quite quickly. But if you provide a second question, which gives a bit more, ask them a more in-depth question as well, and if you have those on the same page, it just slows them down a bit, makes them think about the question more rather than going to search for the answer. They have to justify the answer. So the second question is, what can we interpret about the relationship between whale stress levels and commercial whaling numbers from the graph above? So students have to interpret that information there. So we've got a remember and an understand type question combined to slow them down. So combining questions and providing a bit of context will slow students down and make them think more about how to answer that question. So we're now on to apply. So this requires students to take the knowledge they've learned and transfer it to a different context in order to answer the question. So keywords: compare, contrast, demonstrate, examine. What might happen if, how would you use? And I've got a good example of a question in this kind of category. As I say, because you've got a context around this and it's a different context that they've learned it in, it's harder for them to Google. So they won't find the exact context that you've created for them if you've created it yourself. So they have to, it's a better test of what students know and how they can apply it in a different situation. So it's a much better test of whether they understand the question itself. So here's an apply question, example of one. The beaker contains 300 mils of water and is 20% full. You dissolve 100 grams of salt into the water. How much water can you now add to the beaker? So there's some principles at play there that students need to understand in order to answer the question. You won't have taught them this exact scenario. You'll have taught them the principles behind the question. Excuse me. So transferring what's been taught into a different context in a scenario will make it harder for students to go off and find the answer to that question. And again, as I say, they've generally got around 90 seconds per question. So providing that context, putting it in a slightly different scenario means it's harder and it will take longer for students to answer. Now we get into the really interesting bits at the top of Bloom's taxonomy. So these are a really good test of students' knowledge. As I say, they tend to be more authentic assessments. So they test what students know, but within a scenario or a context which really tests what they've learned and the skills they've learned off the back of that, and how they would potentially apply those in the workplace. So analyze questions. You break the topic down and put it back together to answer the question. So keywords: differentiate, distinguish, infer, research, separate. How would you justify X? What can you infer from this? But as I said before, we're getting into the type of questions that will require more manual marking. Generally, you're asking students to type an explanation to justify an answer to this question. So you're generally thinking about question types such as the essay question or the short answer, probably more the essay question. But they have to think about the answers for a lot longer, and it really is a much better test of their knowledge and how they apply that knowledge. So it's very difficult for students to Google within that time limit and come up with an articulate answer because of the nature of the question, really. So evaluate type questions. These are really interesting question types. Use specific criteria to make decisions. Keywords are assess, critique, determine, evaluate. Example questions: what information would you use to support? What would you recommend for? So these generally have scenarios attached to them. So given this scenario, assess this person's technique. What mistakes have they made? How would you improve X, Y, Z? Again, you can combine a number of different questions to make this a more rich assessment. And a really good example of this is Gavin Knight in Pharmacy and Biomedical Sciences. He conducts a really good authentic assessments where students work in groups to evaluate patient medical histories, and then they enter the results into a Moodle quiz. So it's a really authentic assessment because it's something that students will be expected to do when they graduate. It tests team working skills and evaluation of a situation, and then recommendations off the back of that. So they generally do this assessment in groups, in a room, with a Chromebook that they enter the information on at the end. But there's no reason why you can't offer this as a solo question. So the exact same type of scenarios, but students work on their own to answer those questions. And if I'm honest, I think it's a very good test of students' knowledge. And remember, in that situation, students would have access to the web to answer those questions. When you get into the workplace, you don't lose access to the internet. Many GPs now will use the internet as a guide when they're diagnosing patients. So I think there's something in really mapping what students will do in the workplace, and being less guided by stopping students from accessing the internet, and actually in some cases working with other students. We want our students to be to work in group environments, to solve problems together. We know they'll have access to the internet in the workplace as they carry on their careers. So maybe assessment should really kind of take that on board. What we're really wanting to test is student skills and their ability to apply their knowledge in given scenarios. So possibly this kind of shift to more open book exams that we've been forced to do is maybe a good thing, and it's making us re-evaluate our assessments in a positive way. And this evaluate questions are a really good way of delivering some of those assessments. So finally, create questions. So you combine ideas together to create a new picture. So keywords: arrange, combine, design, develop. How could you improve this situation? What would you predict for? Again, these tend to be essay type questions. They do require manual marking, but the students really have to think about and formulate an answer to these questions. So moving on. Multimedia is a really good tool for stopping students being able to find the answers very, very easily. So some examples of multimedia you could use: diagrams, photos, videos are very good because you can provide a video of a scenario. These all provide quite a rich context to questions, and it's the context really that slows students down and makes them have to apply their knowledge rather than going to find the answers to definitive questions out on the web. As I say, that there are certain things you need to do if you're using things like photos, and to make sure those aren't easily findable on the web using reverse image searches. So if you combine images together, that makes it harder for students to find the original image. If you remove key information from images, so if you do some basic editing to remove those key bits of information, again, it's harder for students to go off and find the answer to those questions. I'll give you some examples now of how to use multimedia. So these are, so if you take the images yourself, that's also a good way forward, because it's very unlikely students will find that exact image out on the web. So are these sugar levels normal? So you're taking something that students should be able to understand. but the image itself is one you've taken yourself, so it's very hard for students to find the exact image which will help them answer their question. You can also do things like using everyday objects to represent something. So what organ is this demonstrating? I'm imagining that is demonstrating a lung, but students wouldn't very easily be able to take that image and find the answer to their question, again within that time limit. So just getting creative really with the use of images, and doctoring, combining, or creating your own images to help students to provide a context for those questions. Unanswerable questions are quite handy as well. So replacing something taught with something made up. So in this example, we're using a cross-section of an orange to represent the anatomy of a kidney, and you're getting students to think outside the box a little bit. In order to answer this question, they need to understand the structure of a kidney, and then reapply their knowledge really to the construct of something made up. So you won't very easily find the answer to this question on Google, because you've added a bit of a distractor within the image itself. So a good way of testing students' knowledge. So just to summarise then, the further you move up the pyramid, the less Googleable the answers are, the more authentic the questioning and the scenarios tend to be, but the more manual marking is likely required. So have a balance, a mix of questions to make your life a bit easier, but also to test students more thoroughly. You aren't going to stop students Googling you're not going to stop students Googling at all if they've got access to it. But you can use these approaches to slow students down and mean that they can't find the answer to the question in the time that's allotted to them based on how many questions there are in the exam. All right, I'm going to at that point jump back to my slides. So back to the first one again, and I think I've covered that really as we're talking through should we stop students from using other sources of information and working with other students? We want students to work collaboratively. And when was the last time you didn't use Google on a daily basis within your job? Students are going to do that. So maybe we need to refactor our assessments to match that kind of reality of what we want the students to be. That's all of the content I was going to deliver. Has anyone got any questions, any specific things about exams they've got coming up they may want some advice on? Or do you have any other tips for colleagues about things that you've seen? I've got the questions in the chat here, so I'll read some of these out. But please feel free to unmute and ask some questions if you want to. I'll work backwards. So Johnny's asked, what accessibility issues? What about accessibility issues for vision impaired students? Yeah, that's a very, very fair point. I took a slide out of this because one way you can slow students down is by using images instead of text, so that it's harder for students to select the text and then go off and search. But I don't like that approach because it can unfairly disadvantage students with visual impairments that use a screen reader. So you do have to bear that in mind. If you include images, you should really include a text description of those images. So the one I covered with the lung or the plastic bottle that looked like a lung, I think you describe exactly what's on the page. So an image of a plastic bottle with a balloon inside it. Which organ is demonstrating? I think that's the fairest way.
Yeah, I was just to expand on that really. Obviously, we have courses like pharmacy, etc., where they use pictures of microscope photos of cells and things like that. So, if the academic is asking, what can you see in this picture? And then you put in the alternative text, a picture of a cell, whatever type of cell it is or whatever, then that's another way that students can kind of get around that. So I think it's about being inventive and trying not to ask those types of questions. But then obviously it's difficult at different levels. Obviously at level 4, the questions are generally going to be easier. It's about kind of recognition of basic themes within their subject area. So I think that's probably where you'd struggle the most. Level 5 and 6 may be a bit more high level, and therefore you don't need to define what the thing is in the picture. But that is definitely sort of a pitfall to be aware of.
Yeah,
and not to fall down it.
That made me think of something else. That another slide that I took out. That's quite a good example. Is when you have abbreviations for things. So especially things like chemistry, when you have, if you use the full name of a chemical, students should be in those disciplines. Students should be aware of the chemical abbreviations of those words. So if you include the abbreviations of them, again, it's harder for students to find those. It's something you can reasonably expect students to know, and you're just making their life a little bit more difficult when you're asking those questions. Things that are reasonable for students to know, you can include those to make it a bit more difficult, I think.
Can I jump in quickly? Sorry, Mike.
Go for it.
Just kind of like from what Johnny was saying there with like the kind of image and the alt text and that, and like you talking about how to design a question. I worked with, before we were locked down, but with Hannah in science, and she asked if there was a better way around doing a particular type of question, and there wasn't, and she'd done a really good job of it. And essentially, initially it was like, you know, what three characters make up the lung, just going on your example there. And if you do that as an MCQ, it, like you say, it's very easy to kind of Google those kind of answers and you just see what's there. She'd use what's called a close question. Now, it's a slightly more advanced version of where you'd have, for instance, a fill in the blank question, because the thing with the fill in the blank is it's almost not dynamic enough. It's fine if you've got one answer, but where you have like three, each box has to be defined as an answer. Now, again, because there are three right answers in that sentence, if you put the wrong answer in the wrong box, you could get you could do the three questions and get them right, but be marked wrong because of the intuition of the system. And it's just to kind of highlight here that, like Johnny was sort of saying, for the level 4, you could use these closed questions at level 4, but they do take a little bit more time to build and understand the coding. But once you get your head into it, and with people like Hannah and Johnny and basically everyone else I see in the chat today who's an OCD, but with the closed questions, what you can do is sort of have that question, have the three sort of either drop downs or fill in the blanks, whatever they are using the close, and you can specify 3 answers essentially per box, so that they can, like you say, you're not necessarily doing it multiple choice, but they have to know kind of what the characteristics are, and they can be marked correctly per bit they get right, and they can basically juggle the answers around within it, whichever box they go into would still give it right. So yeah, it's easier to kind of demonstrate, but it's just to sort of highlight that there are within Moodle other question types, as you say, that do different functions, that do something different, that don't have to be silly high level thinking, but actually are more advanced than just doing an MCQ to try and sort of quickly make that same sort of lower level question.
Yeah,
just wanted to quickly come back, Tom. Yeah, closed questions. I agree with you. You know that they're great. The one pitfall I found as well, though, is so say you've got those 3. If a student was sneaky enough, they could put the same answer in 3 times and still get full marks, because the question still thinks that it's right, potentially. Just something to be aware of. I mean, hopefully we haven't got too many sneaky students out there, but you never know.
Nice. I was just going back through the chat to see if there's any other questions we haven't answered. Don't think we have, actually. Is anything else anyone wanted to ask? Have you got any exams coming up? You want some advice on how to put it together, how to solve it?
Can I ask something in your research you might have dealt with, but I don't know how to answer this? For our some of our professional accredited stuff for NCTJ, for journalism, they kind of measure speed basically. Yeah, it's not just your ability to do it, but they're sort of testing that you can do it under sort of quick duress, which makes sense. I don't know, say you got to write a tweet about Boris Johnson on his bike, and you've got if you want it out within a certain time frame. So I do understand the pedagogic reason they would want to do it. But if you've got any idea, you can do with speed, because presumably, we said we want like a nice open window for students to do it. We don't want them to Google stuff. We want really tough answers. It strikes me I can't put a speed dynamic in my question types. But
the only way you can kind of allocate time for questions is at the quiz level. The only way you could really do that is to have less questions per quiz and have more quizzes potentially, and have them daisy chained together. It's something technology have done in the past. They've got separate quizzes that they daisy chain together. So when you get to the end of one, you have the link for the next one, or you have just the list they have to work through on Moodle. So if you want them to answer in a certain amount of time, then you just have to put that in a separate quiz and say, okay, this quiz is limited to 10 minutes and the next one is 20 minutes. So those questions that are very time restricted, you'd have to lock them down in the construct of the quiz, because you can't allocate time to questions. That's the only way I can think around it, really.
I've got another one. It goes back to you talking about essay-based questions within quiz, and I completely agree with you. They shouldn't be used. However, I did have to do one yesterday in biology, where the lecturer was essentially asking 5 essay-style questions to the students. And I suggested going down the Turnitin route, and she said, no, it has to be within a 90-minute window. It's been kind of set in stone.
Okay.
So for this year, we are going to go down the essay-style route, and I have advised that students write outside of it first, save it somewhere, and then copy it in so that they don't lose it. And obviously 1 question per page, things like that. But in the future, I was wondering maybe something like a Google form might be a way of doing it, because you could have sort of open text boxes, embed that within Moodle, and then close the link off after 90 minutes. So
longer term, what we think is probably a better solution to essay-based exams. So you imagine myself and Tom went to Bath University a few years ago to look at to an online exams forum, and there's a platform called Inspira. There's also another one called Digit Exam, which offer this type of essay-based exam setup. So it's designed for this, so students can type and it automatically saves as they type, and it's designed for essay questions amongst other question types. So longer term, that is probably a better solution as we kind of transition from paper-based written exams to typed ones. For the time being, so the essay question type within Moodle has 2 options to it. You have a type into an essay box space, or you can require attachments. You can switch off the online text option. So if you have to do this, if they're insistent on it, the safest way to do that is, as you've highlighted, get them to do the typing outside of Moodle. They save it in a Word doc, or better, in a Google doc that saves automatically as they go, and then download at the end. But within the essay question type, switch off that online text option. I've got a screenshot somewhere. And then the second option is require 1 attachment. So you have to upload a document as an answer to that question. So all you're getting to do really is distribute that question. So you probably have a Word doc with the questions in the document.
Like a template or something, yeah.
Exactly. So they don't have to come back and forth between Moodle and the text document. So all they have to do is upload that document once they've finished. That's the safest way of doing it, I'd say. Possibly you could do it with Google Forms, but there'd be a lot of development work.
I've just realised the other issue with this was that, so of the 5 questions, there was 5 different markers for each one. So they wanted an easy way for the markers to go in and just mark their own question.
So what you do in that situation, I think, to make your life easy, is not shuffle the questions. You'd have 1 question per document per question. So you have 5 questions with a document attached to each. And you say that Johnny, you're going to mark question A, I'm going to mark question B, etc., etc. So it just makes it easy at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, in that type of situation, you're only going to have a limited number of questions anyway. So you're not going to make it easy. You're not going to make it very. The benefits of randomizing are out the window really, because it's more about allocation of those questions. So yeah, make it easy to as markers and split them up. I'd say it's probably
I think the thing generally when we're talking about quizzes and online assessment is sort of something you alluded to earlier, is that automatic marking versus manual marking. Sort of as an added part of that is the simplest way for a student to take an exam versus the simplicity for the marker. Because obviously, you know, in the early days of Moodle, you know, we used quizzes and they were a brilliant tool, and it freed up a lot of time for academics to kind of do other things and whatever, and they're great for formative tests. But as a summative tool, it to get the most out of it, as you've been talking about in this session, it's going to require that manual marking. And then perhaps this is something that we as OCDs need to kind of talk about when we do our training sessions, is that rather than sort of promote that it's a really easy way of marking things, actually promote that to get the most out of it, we need to have that mix of questions and things like that, perhaps.
Yeah, got you. Yeah, definitely. In terms of that that balance, one of the balance between automatic marking and manual marking, potentially in the future as well, AI will help out with this as well. So you'll get the ability to mark very complex questions with AI. But yeah, we're talking, I don't know, 5-10 years before we kind of see the benefits of that. But I think in the future that might help out a little bit as well.
Yeah.
Just going back to your scenario with using that essay question, we have had students in BAL doing something similar to that in the last window. But it would be interesting to work with you on that one for science, just to make sure it kind of all works as you expect, and just get an idea of kind of scale of how many students are doing it, because it's kind of one of the first times this has happened. We're using this Nanga. It'd be good to kind of record it, so we've got a kind of a benchmark for it, how it works.
Yeah, I think there's about 180 students on the module, so it's a fair sample size, I think.
Okay, yeah, and we'll have a meeting outside of this, if that's all right.
Yeah, definitely. What
you're doing there. Great stuff. Okie doke. We're coming up to the break time now, so if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll call a close there. I hope you enjoyed the session. The recordings will be available in the next couple of days via the website, and thank you very much for taking part. Really appreciate it. Cool. Cheers, folks.